Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Like and share this video. Join the Rabyd Nation, a nation of people dedicated to normalizing atheism and deconversion by hitting the subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button. And your membership options that lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation will be presented to you. Today I want to continue on in my series Heroes of Faith. And we've reached the character in Hebrews 11 known as Abraham. And I want to talk about Abraham, and I'm going to spend a couple weeks doing it, so don't worry about having to wait another 3 weeks for this series to continue on Abraham. I'm going to do a part 1 this week and part 2 next week because I want to break Abraham in half. And the first half today that I want to deal with is how Abraham is a hero of faith because he basically participated in a land grab scheme from land that wasn't his. So, God promised it to him, but we'll get more into details with that later. But the issue here is we're going through Hebrews 11 and we're asking the question, why does the writer of Hebrews think that this person deserves the title, of being in a list of people that demonstrate how you should have faith in God? The evidence of things hoped for, things like that, evidence of things not seen. Why does he feel that these people deserve this title? Why does he feel that they deserve accolades, and then evaluating whether that's a good reason? And so far we haven't had any good luck with these heroes of faith because most of them either believe for mundane reasons or they participated with God in genocide or so on and so forth, where the reasons given aren't great. And Abraham, the problem with dealing with Abraham, of course, is he is considered the father of faith for several religions, major religions, from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. All people look to Abraham, as their kind of origin story, really, of how faith got started. For the Jews, of course, Abraham is the person who founded the Israelites, their nation, their people. For Christians, he becomes the first person of faith that leads to Christ. And then for Islam, of course, they look at Ishmael and several other things when it comes to Abraham because, God has this, way of really complicating matters by not sticking to his guns. So we'll continue to talk about that. But I want to get into the text. This is Hebrews 11, 8 through 16. And we're going to talk about, why the writer of Hebrews really thinks that Abraham is this great guy. So here's the text. It says, by faith Abraham, when called to a place he would later receive as inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful, who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and countless as the sand of the seashore. All of the people were still living by faith when they died. All of these people were still, they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of a country that they had left, they would have had an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, so how do you become a hero of faith according to the writer of Hebrews? Why is Abraham looked up to? Because he got this promise from God that the land that he was sojourning in, he was wandering about in this land, that he was told to get up out of Ur of the Chaldees and go to this land. And, he was told that by God, and God starts to honor him because he continues to be obedient to him, continues to show faith in him by, doing, believing the promise, believing this promise that, someday you'll have this land and your descendants will be numerous as the sand of the seashore. In that society and culture, having descendants, having heirs was a big thing. And so, he's an old man with an old wife So from a practical standpoint, what else have you got but God if you're trying to produce a child with your wife, seeing you haven't done it yet? Now, a lot of things are unbelievable about the story when it comes to Abraham and Sarah. But basically, when we really look at it, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is because they believed the promise and acted on that promise by moving out of their old country, by staying in a land that wasn't theirs, and believing that someday it would be, and believing the promise of God that someday Abraham would have his own descendants through Sarah, as numerous as the sand of the seashore, as numerous as the stars in heaven, which is, that's why he's a hero of faith at first. We'll get into the other reason next week, but let's take a look at some of the problems of this story. The most obvious elephant in the room is, did Abraham even exist? At the time that Abraham is finally put on paper, it's been well over 1,000 years of time that would have had to pass in order for this story to be true. Abraham lives, at least 1,200 years according to the Jewish tradition before any of this was written down. And so you have the story of Abraham growing and changing and being different for 1,200 years. So whether or not he existed, there's no good historical evidence for it at all. In fact, they just, the more you try to link it to some of the stuff in the story, the less possible it becomes. But the other thing about it is this notion that somehow one can inherit simply because you believe God has promised it to you. Abraham gets shown a place in the story, if we look at it as literature, that he doesn't own. Okay, and that someday God says, you're going to own this. This is going to be your descendants forever. Now, the forever part seems to be really negotiable. And you have Christians coming along, well, yeah, it's a spiritual kingdom, so that's why it's forever and ever, but that's not the way it's originally supposed to be taken. So basically, you're a hero of faith because you leave your country, you go to a place that isn't yours and believe a promise of God that someday it will be, and you have a kid while old when your wife is also old, which there's no verification of that, by the way. It's interesting that the story talks about Sarah being very beautiful still, at 80 years of age. She's still beautiful, and it talks in one of the stories, Abraham gets in trouble because he's sporting with his wife in a garden, and the king at that time sees them sporting around. Well, that's a clever euphemism for they're fooling around, and and somehow we're supposed to believe this, given the nature of things that we know. You live in this place for a while. Your son Isaac lives there for a while. Jacob lives there for a while. He has a bunch of kids, and one of them ends up saving their biscuits from a famine. That's the overall story, and this is what makes you a hero of faith. In short, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that you become a hero of faith because you believe a promise, don't receive it, but still believe it anyway. I can see why the writer of Hebrews would consider Abraham, and I think I understand why the Abrahamic religions, from which they get their name from this character, want to continue to put him up front, because it taps into this idea of faith being evidence of things hoped for. This hope for things not seen thing is big in Abraham. I think that's why the writer of Hebrews, after listing a few people, really stops to center in on Abraham, because he is the living epitome of what he says faith is way back in verse 1 and 2. Because Abraham, as a character in the story, never receives anything that he was promised. He bounces Isaac on his knee, has a bunch of other, one of the parts of the story that people gloss over is that Abraham, after Sarah's death, takes several wives and has kids with them. So apparently, Abraham wasn't the problem of infertility. It was apparently Sarah. And so, we have this element of this story where it's all about having kids and building a family, which is a very, ancient Middle Eastern theme. That's what every man wanted to do, was become prosperous, build his family, have a lot of descendants. That's the whole point of existence for a lot of them. And so even back when this was finally, put to paper and put in a story, and obviously, Genesis in particular is very obviously an edited work where they try to take different tribal traditions and mash them together. And, the JEPD theory has been around for a while, and it's no longer really a theory. It's like, yeah, this is probably what happened. And so you have all this element together, and the idea of becoming a hero of faith simply because you believe a promise that hasn't been fulfilled. Now, why would the writer of Hebrews do that? Okay, I think I know the reason, because by the time the writer of Hebrews himself is putting pen to paper, okay, Christianity has reached its second generation and started its third. Okay, there's this, and their whole founder is this guy who preached this apocalyptic future that was coming, where one generation wouldn't pass before he would return, and he hasn't returned. And so now we have this faith, and so we want to keep the faith going. We want to keep people believing in this promise that they haven't had fulfillment for. Well, what better character in the literature than Abraham himself? The real sad thing to me as an atheist looking at this and looking at it as literature, I'm seeing how the writer of Hebrews is saying it's okay to be gullible. It's okay to believe in something you haven't received. And this is going to be a theme in Christianity for the next 2,000 years, okay? That Jesus is going to return, and we're going to keep people gullible by holding up Abraham as this guy who never received the promise but looked at the promise afar off. And it's a classic salesman technique of, you're investing for the future of your children and your children's children, okay? And don't get me wrong, I think there is some wisdom in, the whole idea of planting a tree that, your grandchildren will enjoy, but you won't. That's kind of the thing, right? But at the same time, to use it as a belief system, as a religious system, and to put all this together, we have Abraham being held up as this hero of faith simply because he believed something that he never received. I mean, he got to see Isaac, and he got to see, Jacob and Esau, maybe, according to the story, because these people live ridiculous ages, by the way, that haven't been verified either. And so the story becomes a legendary thing. It's whoever created Abraham, whoever took some of the stories that maybe existed and concocted them together, because I think this shows examples of building, a legend, because a lot of what the Bible does is build legends. It takes probably mundane characters and turns them into legendary figures. A lot, by the way. And so Abraham becomes this guy that is built into this idea of, we may have not received the promise that these people were given yet, but if we wait long enough, God will fulfill his promise. And the Christians were facing a very similar thing, and I think that's why the writer of Hebrews looks at this. In fact, he makes an emphasis of all these people died in faith, having not received the promise, okay? And to him, and he's going to point at the promise as being Jesus, okay? So what the writer of Hebrews is doing is he's using Old Testament characters to create this understanding that you haven't received the promise yet, but you will. It's the age-old pitch of this is a long-term investment and you only get the benefit of it when you die. And that is one of the big sales pitches of religion. Now, the problem with any afterlife story, as everybody well knows, is you can't really test to see whether it's a valid thing until you're dead. And so because there's no evidence for it, I hear a lot of people, I've received a comment just this week, there's a hell, you'll see. Really, you got pictures? You heard somebody say that there was a hell and you believed them without any evidence. Okay, that doesn't make you a good person for, and this seems to be behind that comment, a silent wish that I go to hell. Okay, thanks, nice guy. But it's this idea of creating through faith. This is why faith is auto-deceptive. And you see it right here with the story of Abraham. That Abraham, if he actually existed, is auto-deceived into believing a promise that he received no benefits for. Okay, and the deception becomes so large that people believe stuff and hold on to stuff, even though they don't have any of this. And we'll look at the final result of this promise. Because what it really is a land grab scheme. And God is saying, hey, I got a land grab scheme for you, Abraham. You may not see it in your own lifetime, but we're going to work on this. We're going to have you have a bunch of kids until you become a nation. You're going to go to Egypt for a while, for 400 years. And when you come back, your descendants will be an army, and you'll take this land and you'll conquer it, and it'll be yours and your descendants forever, and so on and so forth. But right now, you're small, and we're just trying to, we got to do the early investments and all this other stuff. And God is really a con artist in this one, okay? He's just like, you're God, just nuke them, okay, and take over the land. But God doesn't seem to, because that's the end final result anyway, because in the end, what the story says through Joshua is they wiped a whole bunch of people off the face of the earth. They killed them all, okay? So why does God need Joshua to do his dirty work 400 years later? Why doesn't he just do it now for Abraham? And so we either have a God that can't pull that off, or we're trying to reinterpret the events of life and put God in it, as we write this story. And to me, you can really see the auto-deceptive nature of faith in the character of Abraham, because he believes God without receiving anything for it. And it's naive. Okay, it's just naive. He's a very naive character, and he's going to demonstrate when I talk about this next week that he's kind of dangerous in his naivete, because he's willing to do anything in order to receive this promise, thinking that something is going to happen. But as I look at the character of Abraham and I look at how Hebrews uses him, the real issue is reinforcing this notion of believing in something you haven't actually received and never will. And when we see the writer of Hebrews dealing with his own generation of Christians, where he's writing to a group of people that, we have Jesus who made all these promises and promised his return, and it still hasn't happened yet. So that, my friends, is how you become a hero of faith, by basically participating in a land grab scheme and believing it, okay, and believing that someday you're going to have this thing. And then the story of the Bible, of course, actually gets into this idea of how they achieved that, how they got that. And I think that's one of the more insidious things about the whole thing of how this religion, these various Abrahamic religions, have been so, successful, because of the character of Abraham illustrating how you believe in something but never receive it, and that's a good thing. How you participate in this land grab scheme that to this day still causes turmoil in the Middle East. The people today want to get rid of this notion that somehow it's all political factors or whatever in the Middle East, and that's not really what it is at all. Okay, it's really very much, this continued fighting over promises. Who gets the promise? Ishmael, Isaac. And the whole thing here of this promise in Hebrews continues to be this, hey man, we were promised this land through Abraham, or we were promised this land through Abraham, or we were promised this land through Abraham. And we still have this issue to this present day of dealing with this issue. And I think it's one of those weird things that how faith has become so auto-deceptive to a whole group of people. They want to believe this so much. And Abraham is a good example of wanting to believe something so much that he will gullibly follow his God and never see anything for himself, when God could have easily given him his promise just like that, if he is truly the God that he says he is. And so, yeah, this is how to be a fair hero of faith. Participate in a land grab scheme and believe it, and never receive any benefits of it until you're dead. Okay, I mean, you could say that Isaac was a benefit. You could say he could see, the descendants coming forward, and that was a benefit. He had a child through a woman he had known and loved all his life. That was a benefit, though he had, other wives. So you have this whole thing with the story of Abraham. But as always, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say in the comments. Abraham is a very interesting figure, and I've just touched, part one of this where I talk about his faith in believing the promise of God and how that's auto-deceptive. But, next week I'm going to get into one of the more cruxy, big stories of why Abraham's a hero of faith, and I'll talk more about how you become a hero of faith by almost killing your kid. So we'll talk more about that next time. But I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say, so comment away, and what are some of your takes on this story and things like that. It's always interesting as we demystify the Bible, what people think the literature could have meant, what things it could have done. I think that's very interesting, and so we'll have to see what you guys have to say. So thanks very much for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. You guys are awesome. The channel continues to grow slowly, surely, steadily, but it's growing. And so thank you very much. And I want to just give a special shout out to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens. These are the members of the channel that make this channel and the videos like this one that don't necessarily get all the likes and shares that some of my other videos get. They are the ones that make these kind of things possible, particularly for those who are deconverting. So thank you to them. And as always, live your best life. Don't waste your time on the trappings of religion and faith, but rather give yourself and your time and your money opportunities to yourself, to the people you love and care for, and to make this place a better world. You'll be happier if you do. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.